name is Manny Brandt. Actually, my full given name is Manfred John Clayton Brandt. I'm a 64-year-old German-American white man. I've actually been a white man all my life, but for the first 30 years, I just didn't know that much about it. I grew up in small towns in Iowa, 300 people or less, all white, all Christian communities. And as I was growing up, I had a non-experience and didn't even know I was having it. For 18 years, I had many conversations with many people about many things, but it was only when I went off to the university that I realized that I had never actually ever had a single conversation with another white person about being white. Well, how convenient. Okay, let's start with some shared language. It might be useful for us to have a good working understanding of what we mean by diversity. Here's a simple way to think about it. 3 parts. First, diversity is about all of the ways that we are both similar and different, not just the differences, but the similarities also. Number 2, it turns out that as human beings, members of the human race, we're more similar than we are different. I do a lot of work with the human genome sciences people, and they're mapping out that human DNA. They tell us that as human beings, we are 99.9% genetically similar. So we have a strong foundation of similarity. Part number 3, though, this is where we start to move to the deep end of the pool. Part number 3 simply says that the differences matter, especially those differences that might not matter to me. I'm always aware of the differences that are important to me, but I may not always be aware of the differences that are important to you. And human nature being what it is, sometimes if you bring to me a difference that's important to you but not one that's important to me, I have a tendency to minimize your difference or sometimes even reject it entirely. Here's something you may not know. We all have a little voice in our heads. My little voice resides right back here about the base of my ponytail. My little voice, it turns out, is particularly ignorant but has no shortage of opinions. Has an opinion on everybody I meet and puts it out there in the first 3 seconds. So if you tell me about a difference that's important to you, but maybe not one that's important to me, my little voice steps in to help me understand what you might be meaning. And my little voice has a tendency to reinterpret or understand your reality from my particular perspective. I meet 3 different kinds of people in life. First people I meet are sensitive people like me. Now it turns out that sensitive people care about the same things that I care about, and that's of course what makes them sensitive. Second group of people I meet are the insensitive people. We've all met them. They're real easy to spot. Well, it turns out that what's really going on is that insensitive people simply don't care about the things that I care about, and that of course is what makes them insensitive. And then the third group of people I meet are the people that are too sensitive. I'm sure you've met people like that, people that in your mind you say they are just way too sensitive about whatever the dimension of diversity might be that we're talking about. Here's what's really going on with those people that are too sensitive. It turns out that people that I label as too sensitive simply care about things that I don't care about. But in order to keep my reality intact, rather than me say maybe there's something I need to learn here, I lay it off on them. I explain the situation to myself by saying, well, the problem is theirs because they're simply too sensitive. Well, there are a couple of things that get in our way of being as culturally fluent as we might like to be. Let's look at those. First one is that when it comes to matters of diversity, oftentimes there are things we don't know, and we don't even know that we don't know them. So we really have to keep an open mind to being able to learn new things from people and situations that we might not expect. Secondly, we have a strong tendency as human beings to engage in what I call either-or thinking. Either the light is on, either the light is off, problems, solutions, that kind of thing. And we're so locked into either-or thinking that it's awfully hard oftentimes when we encounter differences to be able to move toward both and thinking. So for starts, let me encourage you to, in a new situation, try to at least think in terms of either and maybe a couple of ors. And then you're one step away from moving into both and thinking. And the third thing that gets in the way is simply human nature. How our brains work, how we think, how we organize information, how we add meaning to information. The better we can understand how our brains work and how we add meaning to information and how we come to the conclusions that we come to, the better able we are to work fluently with both similarities and differences. One of the tools that can be useful to us in understanding diversity and cultural fluency is the diversity wheel. The diversity wheel is a simple way for us to map out our simple three-part definition of diversity. We're more similar than we are different, the differences matter, and it's all about similarities and differences. Now let's take a look at the diversity wheel, starting right from the center, our personality. Personality is at the core of everyone's diversity wheel. We know a few things about personality. First of all, everyone has one, and that's what makes life interesting. Secondly, we know from the social scientists that as babies we're born into the world with the beginnings of our personality, our lead style, if you will. All of us have spent time with babies, and we can understand that some babies come into the world and their lead style is such that it's 10 o'clock at night and we're all done feeding and baby's not hungry. We're wanting to put our feet up and baby's quite content to play. We want to go to sleep at 11 and baby's already been asleep for an hour. We love those babies because their lead style and our lead style come together very nicely. Then there are other babies that are a little bit different. Those babies, it's 10 o'clock at night, we want to put our feet up and relax. Baby wants attention. It's 3 in the morning, we've been asleep for a few hours, baby is wide awake and wants to be with us. We still love those babies, but they're a little bit harder to line up our lead style and their lead style. All right, let's start with the primary dimensions of diversity on our diversity wheel. These are the dimensions of diversity that, for the most part, social scientists tell us we are born with, have no choice over, can't change. I, for example, was born in 1942. I didn't get to pick that year. I was born as a baby boy. I didn't get to pick that deal. I was born with white skin. I didn't get to pick that. I was born with certain mental and physical abilities. That's what I have to work with. I was born in Canada. That was my nation of origin. Now let's take a look at a couple of other dimensions of diversity that are primary to everybody. And ethnicity. We'll start with ethnicity. Ethnicity refers to the people that came before us, our crew, our clan, our tribe, those ancestors that preceded us. In my case, my primary ethnicity is Germanic, meaning that my grandparents on my mother's side migrated from Germany to Canada. My grandparents on my father's side migrated from Germany to Iowa. Now, for some of us, our ethnicity deeply informed who we are and how we show up in the world. For others of us, we may know a little bit about our ethnic background, but it really hasn't affected how we are and how we show up in the world today. Another example of how the differences may matter. My ethnic background may be very important to me. Your ethnic background may be not of so much importance to you. Take a look at race. It might be useful to think about that word race as being in quotation marks. Now, why would we want to take that dimension of diversity, the idea of race, and put it in quotation marks? Well, simply because it is just that. It's an idea. It's a made-up idea. It's what the social scientists call a social construct. Here's how it works. The idea of race, first of all, hasn't been around very long, since maybe the late 1700s. It was developed by social scientists of their day, white men who looked a lot like me, and the whole idea behind putting people into these racial categories was to be able to prove or demonstrate to other folks that certain groups of people were in fact superior and other groups of people were in fact inferior. Now, there are a couple of other things that are useful to notice about race. One is that the idea of race is not scientifically grounded. There's no test for race. We could take a drop of blood from everybody in this building and put it under the microscope, and it would in no way help us to understand which racial group to put people into. The idea of race is based on surface categories, things like skin color and skin tone, hair color, hair texture, those kinds of things. It's all surface kinds of things. It's what I call the figment of the pigment. Now, simply because race is a social construct doesn't mean that it doesn't have powerful impact on the lives of people. We want to make sure that we're clear on that. The impact, however, comes not from the idea of race in and of itself, but by the way in which people have invested meaning in this whole notion of race. Another thing to look at in terms of race is just the fluid concept here. Look at the census. When we started taking the census, we had maybe 3 categories. Now we have a multitude of categories, and people can check any box they want. I have a good friend who grew up in India. He was born in India during British colonial rule, and at that time he was classified as a black man. When he was in his early 20s, he decided to fly to New York and go to law school. As soon as he set foot on American soil, he became a white man. Well, that lasted for a few years, and now he is an Asian. So this whole notion of race, it's awfully hard to pin down, it's awfully hard to really quantify, and yet it deeply impacts how people's lives evolve. How many of you have seen the sunrise recently or the sunset? It's a beautiful thing, right? All those lovely colors. The only problem is that it too is a made-up idea. The sun doesn't really rise and set. The earth turns, and we know that. But we've gotten into a consensual trance in this country that that's how we talk about the sun rising and setting. Well, likewise, we've gotten into a consensual trance in this country about how we talk about race and how we think about race. Well, let's look at one last primary dimension of diversity, sexual orientation. Sometimes people say, well, Manny, what's that one doing in the primary dimension? I thought sexual orientation was a choice or a lifestyle that people made. You know, we know a few things about sexual orientation. We know, for example, that everybody has a sexual orientation. And we know that if you look at cultures all around the world, you find that there are a variety of sexual orientations represented. Some people are attracted to people of the opposite sex. Some people are attracted to people of the same sex. And some people are attracted to people of both the opposite and the same sex. Now, there may be some debate going on about whether sexual orientation is a choice or a lifestyle or just simply something that we're born with. We're not here to debate that today. We simply know that sometimes people can be discriminated against or treated in a one-down way around their sexual orientation or around any of these other dimensions of primary diversity. We want to make sure that people understand that the dimensions of diversity that are primary, those that we really can't control or change, are the ones that we want to focus on. Let's look at the secondary dimensions of diversity. If the dimensions of diversity in the primary ring are the ones we're born with, have no choice over, really can't control, then the dimensions of diversity in the secondary ring are those that we are at first born into, but then later on have some choice over. My father was a Lutheran minister, and when I was born a little baby Lutheran. I didn't know that at the time, and later on I've been able to make some choices about religion and about where I might choose to live and the kinds of relationships that I want to be involved in, the kinds of education I want to have. All of the dimensions of diversity in the secondary ring are those dimensions that you really can't tell about somebody just by looking at them. You really have to have a deeper conversation with them. Look at the third ring, those dimensions of diversity that perhaps pertain to our workplace. Now here we have dimensions that perhaps pertain to your expertise, the kind of work you do, or whether you're in management, or whether you belong to a union. All of these things have an impact in terms of how we show up and how we see the world and how we understand how things work. The last level of diversity that we want to look at in our diversity wheel is that ring we call era. Now in the era ring, we're looking at historical events, legislative events, cultural events that may have impacted on a whole group of people in sometimes a positive way and in sometimes a not positive way, in a negative way. Let's take a look at some examples of what we might be talking about. 9/11 was an incident that impacted the lives of many, many people in this country. And certainly some people, it turns out, were more impacted than others. There's some research that was done recently in California looking at low birth weight babies. And they looked at mothers before 9/11 and mothers after 9/11 and the births that took place before 9/11 and after 9/11. Out of those groups of people, they selected only mothers who had an Arabic-sounding last name and compared those babies. And it turned out that a baby born after 9/11 with an Arabic-sounding last name had a 50% greater chance of being born a low birth weight baby. Now they looked at the first names of babies and found that if a baby had both a last name that sounded Arabic and a first name that sounded Arabic, now those babies had a 50% greater chance of being born a low birth weight baby. So there are some examples, if we really look at our history, both recent and past, that would indicate that events can severely impact the kinds of choices that people may have in this secondary ring of diversity. Let me give you one more example. World War II. Soldiers coming back from World War II wanted to start their life. The great American dream, get a good job, buy a home, buy a car, maybe be able to send your kids off to college. Now, as an American soldier, as a white American soldier coming back from the war, I had those dreams. I wanted to buy a house, get a good job, raise my family in a good way. Well, it turns out that in terms of getting a good job, I had all sorts of choices. There were all sorts of unions available to me, and if I had the skill, I could join any one of those unions. I could get a good job, and in terms of housing, there were all sorts of low-cost loans that were available. Levittown was being constructed, so I could buy a house at a rate that I could afford and live in a neighborhood that I wanted to live in. And so I had some equity. I was building for my future. I had something I could pass on to my children. Now, if I were a black soldier coming back from World War II, a somewhat different story. I too wanted to get a good job, but it turns out that the only union that was available to me was the Porters Union. All of the other unions were closed by policy to men of color. I wanted to buy a good home in a neighborhood that I wanted to live in, but it turns out that all of those low-income interest loans that were available to people, my white counterparts were not available to me. So I could not get as good a job. I couldn't get as good a loan for a house. Levittown, of course, was closed to people of color. You couldn't buy a house or from anybody in Levittown if you were a person of color. So now I have less equity. I have less things that I can pass on to my children. It's important for us to notice that in this country there are certain dimensions of diversity that do result in people having more or less opportunities. This is what we call unearned automatic advantage, or sometimes when we're talking about skin color, white skin privilege. Well, let's review the things we've talked about today. First of all, it's our shared understanding of what we even mean by diversity. We're talking about all of the ways we're similar and different. As human beings, we're much more similar than we are different. And number three, the really important one, the differences matter, especially the ones that may not matter to me. Now, we looked at the diversity wheel and we deepened our understanding about what we mean by all of the differences and similarities. We looked at the primary dimensions of diversity, those dimensions that we really can't change, we're born with. And then we looked at the secondary dimensions of diversity, those dimensions that we're born into, maybe don't have a choice over initially, but over time we do have some choices. We looked at the influence of workplace on our diversity wheel and the way in which we show up in the world. And then lastly, we looked at the era events, those events that impact on everybody, but also sometimes impact on particular groups of people. We looked at how era events can limit the choices that one group has and maybe sometimes expand the choices that another group might have. The important thing to remember is that we want to watch out for either or thinking and really move toward both and thinking. We want to remember that we're here to take care of ourselves, take care of each other, and take care of this place. And in order to do that, we have to really pay attention to what's going on around us. We have to notice what we notice out loud in a good way, and we have to be willing to stand up and be cultural allies, looking at those places where inequities might exist, and also looking at the ways that we can play a part in helping people live a world that works well for everybody.